Strange with a handheld microphone, but anyway, but we'll now turn to tonight's event, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back to the Chemistry Centre our chair this evening, Dr. Gerald Craston, who is the UK Government Chemist and Chief Scientific Officer at LGC, where he is responsible for the leadership of teams delivering R&D programmes in analytical quality and metrology, providing regulatory-related analysis and supplying services to the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. Derek joined LGC in 1991 and has previously carried out a variety of research and development roles relating to new methods of analysis. Prior to becoming government chemist, Derek was responsible for LGC's pharmaceutical business and managed operations in the UK and Germany that supplied a comprehensive range of reference material products and high-quality analytical services in areas such as product compliance testing, impurity profiling, leachables and extractables testing, and particle characterization. His research interests include micro-nanotechnology, in other words, lab on a chip, advanced separation science, and spectroscopy and bioanalysis. Derek has a degree in chemistry from the University of St Andrews and a PhD from Imperial College London for research in enzyme electrochemistry. Prior to joining LGC, Derek spent 2 years at the University of Texas, Austin, USA, undertaking postdoctoral research into electrochemical appliances of scanning probe microscopy, and 3 years of AEA technology, Harwell, working on applied electrochemistry, including sensors, fuel cells, batteries, and cold fusion. So, with further ado, I will now hand over to Derek, and I'm sure he'll make a much better effort at the microphone than myself. And Derek will introduce the lecture tonight and introduce our panellists. Thank you very much.
Are we working now? No, we still need to use the microphone.
Yes, it's on. Should be on.
Okay, can everyone hear? Is that working? Okay. Right. Again, let me add my welcome and thanks very much for everyone for attending and for watching online. Since well before the current economic crisis, funding and resources for food sampling and analysis have been progressively falling. This means that the number of products that can be tested has fallen rapidly, which has led to a system where products are only tested when there's already known to be a problem. Incidents such as the recent horse meat issue not only damage consumer confidence, they can also potentially damage the UK food industry, which the government is trying to grow and to boost for the economy. The RSC has already issued some press releases on this topic. For those of you who are interested, on the 1st of February 2003, in association with the Association of Public Analysts, a press release was put out that's welcoming the commitment of leading food retailers in their commitment to DNA test meat products as routine to ensure high food standards for customers. Then in March 2013, a further press release was put out warning that further food fraud could remain undiscovered under the current system of food testing in the UK. And that's the reason why the RSC decided to bring together this debate and holding this panel discussion with the aim of teasing out some of the issues that need to be tackled in order to move beyond the current news stories to consider the whole issue of a safer state of food security for the UK. So, without much further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists for tonight. And then after I've introduced them all, and I'm not going to go through their entire CV, I think for those of you who are sat down in front, you should have their biography in front of them, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves a little bit. And after that, I'm going to invite each one to talk for 5 minutes to give their perspective on the current issues. So, starting furthest away from me, I'd like to have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Wolfe. Mark has been as part of the Food Standards Agency in a previous life. He's a current member of the Royal Society of Chemistry's Analytical Methods Committee, and he has over 32 years' worth of experience in the food industry. Next to Mark is Mr. Gerald Heddle. Gerald is Director of Inspection and Enforcement and Standards Division at the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. He's had a long and successful career in the pharmaceutical industry and also with the NHS and generally in the healthcare industry. So he will give us an interesting perspective on health in relation to food issues. Next to Gerald is Miss Liz Moran. Liz is the current president of the Association of Public Analysts. She's got more than 20 years worth of experience as an analyst and a food analyst, and in 2006 was awarded an MChem-A. At the moment, Liz works associated with Eurofans, who is doing a lot of the testing of the meat products inside of the UK at the moment. And then final panelist is Dr. Chris Smart. Chris is currently at the Leatherhead Food Research Association. He's a biotechnologist by background, but he's been working in the food sector now for a number of years, including industrial positions. And for those of you who are not aware, Leatherhead Food Research does a lot of research work and consultancy work directly with the food industry, and he will give us an industrial perspective on the current crisis. So I think we'll go from the far side inwards. So if you're ready, Mark, please go ahead, introduce yourself, and give us 5 minutes of your views on the current issue.
All right. Thank you, Derek. Can you hear me? No? Hello? 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 Yes, okay. Right. Okay, I'm Mark Wolfe. Up to 2009, I used to work in the Food Standards Agency. I was head of amongst other things, head of the Food Authenticity Program there, which was a program of research to develop novel methods for food labeling and food standards issues, and also there was a program of surveys which we looked at the UK market in various foods and saw whether there was mislabeling or misdescription going on. On the horse meat, in fact, I wasn't that surprised to find an issue of food adulteration taking place in the market, but I was very surprised to find the extent of it, how large a problem it was, because I dealt with many issues of mislabeling and misdescription, and they tended to be rather confined to certain quite small companies, and it was quite a surprise to see, first of all, that this issue was not only quite widespread in the UK, but even more widespread in Europe, and I think this is quite a serious issue to deal with. The second thing I'd like to mention was that it's important that we give the tools to the enforcement labs to in fact enforce the law. This means still having quite an active program of research, because the public analysts themselves do not have the resources to carry out research into these methods, and therefore it's important if government are in charge of the regulations, they ought to assist the enforcement labs to develop the correct methods to enforce the rules. Secondly, thirdly, there should be improvements in the food chain at the moment. I think one of the things is that the shorter the food chain, the easier it is to see that things are going okay. And one of the things that's obviously happened over the last few years is the length of the food chain has got longer. And often, I think this is caused by price pressure from supermarkets who, in fact, give a lot of manufacturers quite low margins. And so the manufacturers have to look for their cheapest raw materials. And this often involves then seeking out materials often outside the UK and often through a whole series of stores and brokers that make the food chain so long and so difficult to police. And I think it's about time that that manufacturers, A, were paid a reasonable price, and B, that they could shorten their food chains so that there was much more emphasis on straight traceability to be able to go right the way from the farm to the fork without having so many steps to check. Okay, I think that's...
Yes. Thanks very much, Mark. Now over to you, Gerald.
Well, thank you, Derek, and thank you to the RSC and Pauline for the kind invitation to join you. If you'll forgive a flippant comment to begin with, this whole incident has obviously given a whole new meaning to that invitation that you have when you buy things on the internet to click and add to the cart. I'll leave it at that. I won't go any farther. But perhaps I should start with a disclaimer. One, I'm surprised, flattered to have been asked to join this panel, but I'm perhaps even more surprised that I accepted the invitation, as I am not involved with food safety and know very little about it. But I do hope that what I do know about, which is medicine safety, has some parallels, and we can actually draw on those. But I would say, by way of disclaimer, any opinion that I would express this evening, it could not be taken as the views of the MHRA, which wouldn't be expected to have an opinion on this subject, nor indeed for Her Majesty's government. Any thoughts are my own. But one reflection is clearly, as far as we know, and thankfully, there is little or no actual health damage that's arisen from this incident, despite the concerns that have arisen at various points. But there has been a massive impact. I was struck just yesterday at reading the result of a Which survey of some 2,000 adults, which said that 60% of them had changed the way they shop as a result of this incident. The Chief Executive, Richard Lloyd, said there's been a collapse in confidence in the food industry, a collapse in confidence. And that whole issue of confidence is one that resonates with me with respect to medicine safety, because one of the most valuable things is that patients should trust the medicines they are taking. And I suspect there's a parallel with food as well. The Chief Executive of Morrison's, Dalton Phillips, has said recently that he believes the food supply chain is too complex. Well, you're, I think, by virtue of the fact you're here, for the most part, chemists. And as chemists, you know very well that testing is a poor substitute for control within the supply chain. It's evident that you will only find what you're looking for. And if you're dealing with criminal adulteration of a product, then no routine testing is likely to find it in the first instance. Once you know that it's there, of course, it's different. And there is a parallel in medicines, which if you bear with me for 2 minutes, I'll seek to explain, which some of you will be aware of. which was an incident that arose perhaps 5 years ago, in which a number of very serious adverse events were recognised, mostly in the United States, related to the use of heparin. There were serious allergic type reactions, but there were also loss in blood pressure and ultimate death. In fact, that incident, which went up to 2008, was reported to have resulted in no less than 200 people dying in the United States. Now, initially, nobody understood what was happening, and it was only as a result of chemical analysis that it was actually determined that the product was deliberately adulterated with chondroitin sulfate. And this was a financially driven crime of adulterating this product. The chondroitin sulfate had a similar anticoagulant effect to heparin, and therefore, with the tests as they existed, it would not have been detected and was not detected. There's a lesson there, as I say. You cannot rely on routine testing to find what a criminal might do with your product. And I suggest that's true with food. For heparin, no less than 1 billion pigs, believe it or not, 1 billion, that's one with 9 noughts, pigs in China contribute to the heparin that we use. That heparin is taken from the mucosa of pigs, it goes to Singapore, it's purified, it comes on. This is just for one manufacturer, by the way. Other manufacturers may have other supply routes. It comes onto Europe and it's formulated into a product. The key to the control, and this is the point I'm making, I think, with food, is a knowledge of the supply chain and an appropriate verification throughout that supply chain, not testing, I would add. For heparin, it could be argued there was no choice but to have a complex supply chain. Where else in the world would you find 1 billion pigs? Even Denmark can't compete with that number of pigs. But the question perhaps we will want to debate this evening is the same true for food? Does the supply chain have to be that complex? And I leave you with that question. Thank you.
Very much, Gerald. That was a fascinating parallel that you're drawing between pharmaceuticals and foods, and maybe something we'll pick up on as we go through the debate. Liz, can I hand over to you now and give your perspective?
Okay, good evening, and is that working? Okay. Good evening, and thank you for inviting me to the RSC. As Derek said in his introduction, I am a public analyst and the president of the Association of Public Analysts, and find myself and my colleagues at the eye of the storm at the moment as far as the testing of samples for horse meat is concerned. This is not something that we were routinely looking for before this particular issue occurred, and although I'm not surprised that thus the issue has occurred and thus horse meat is being used in these products. Again, as Mark mentioned, I'm surprised at the scale, and this is certainly not something that was on the radar of the intelligence provisions that we have in the UK at the moment. The Food Standards Agency are conducting a survey looking at samples, products on the market. So they've got a 3-phase survey currently in progress, and that consists of local authorities, trading standards and environmental health officers going out to businesses. They may be at retail level, as a manufacturer or other level, and actually sampling beef products, and they're being submitted to public analyst laboratories to be tested for horse and porcine DNA. The timescale on this is very tight. Obviously, the public want answers. They want to know the extent of the issue and what can be done to actually prevent it occurring again. And the laboratory system is coping, but with some difficulty. There's no central provision for testing laboratories for enforcement of food safety. And it's sort of been left to market forces. There's a combination of publicly funded labs, mainly run by local authorities, and private sector labs, and the laboratory I work in is one of those private sector labs. We are funded purely through the fees that we receive for testing samples. And as Derek mentioned previously, the number of samples being tested over the last few years has decreased. So it's been very difficult for laboratories to be able to make their way financially. And market forces have taken their toll, and many laboratories have closed. Just in the last 2 years, 3 of the 10 laboratories in England have closed. And not only has the laboratory closed, but the public analysts and the senior scientific staff with many, many years' experience have been lost to the system, leaving us potentially very vulnerable when an issue like this actually occurs. So we have just about been coping on this occasion, but only by really pushing the boat out, so that laboratory staff are practically working 24/7 weekends to try to get these results out, and we want to be able to provide a good service and make sure that the capacity is there. But the system has been in severe decline for a number of years, and we would certainly call on the government to look at the provision of testing capacity to ensure that the UK is equipped to deal with this kind of issue when it arises. Obviously, the issue wasn't discovered in the UK, but now that we know about it, obviously we need to discover the extent of it. But this is one particular issue, and it may be that another issue will raise its head in 6 months' time or in 6 years' time. And as laboratories, we have to very quickly be able to react, to potentially develop new testing, and be able to provide a service to the Food Standards Agency and DEFRA should it be required. Gerald made the point there that testing is not an end in itself, and that it's not just a case that we need to do more testing. We do have a risk-based system, and provided we have good intelligence to back it up, that's certainly how we should be targeting funding. The food industry obviously does its own testing as well, although I think there has probably been too much of a reliance on paper traceability, and because obviously paperwork can be forged, and there's obviously, in the case of the horse meat, there's obviously been some forgery going on for the for very big retailers like Tesco, who very much value their reputations, to have been caught out in this way. Something has seriously gone wrong. So certainly, in my opinion, targeted testing can be an excellent complement to auditing and paper trail, and I certainly think that there is more scope for targeted testing to be done in the industry as well as in the enforcement sector.
It was a fascinating perspective from somebody who's really at the coalface of responding to this and providing the testing. So we'll pick up, I'm sure, on some of those themes as we move through. Chris, can I give you the floor now and give your perspective from the industry side?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. I think it's fair to say that the UK food industry, and to some extent the European food industry, spend an awful lot of time and attention and money on making sure that the food that they produce is safe, of sufficient quality, and obviously meets authenticity standards. Many food companies employ technical directors, technical managers, people whose responsibility, amongst other things, is to make sure the product they're producing and that the suppliers that they're using are appropriate. That includes obviously things like labelling, but also food safety and food quality too. It's something that's taken very, very seriously, especially by the big companies whose brands are, well, they live and die by their brands, don't they, as we all know. So it is taken very, very seriously. And the vast majority of food businesses do meet those minimum legal requirements 100% of the time. And in fact, many of them, most of them, I'd say in the UK, the vast majority actually do more than meet the minimum legal requirements and meet requirements laid down by industry standards, such as the British Retail Consortium Technical Standard and others. So the retailers have their own, and they're very, very stringent. And all of their suppliers need to meet those requirements. And they are, as I said before already, they're very exacting. In addition, many food companies, especially the large ones, have dedicated supply chains that they can trust completely. It's not uncommon for a company to, in the case of meat, to have their supplier slaughtering and deboning the meat products and selling the product directly to them, meeting the specifications and obviously sometimes certificates analysis they lay down within their specification documents. So some supply chains can be very short. For some companies, and in the case of meat, as we've seen, some of those supply chains can be incredibly long and very, very complicated. And that's sometimes because, as Mark said previously, there was pressure on food companies to supply products, finished product, at the best possible cost. In order to do that, sometimes they go to the commodity market and outside of their normal dedicated supply chain in order to find those ingredients and those raw materials. And sometimes with companies that have dedicated supply chains, they might even go to the commodity market when periods where there's a huge demand for their product. So that can happen. Of course, they ask for specifications, and as has already been pointed out, sometimes criminals, obviously, provide raw materials and ingredients that aren't what we expect them to be. So I think that's an important point, that the food industry in the UK is pretty diligent around these kinds of things and tries to get it right. I think it's also fair to say that traceability is taken very, very seriously in the food industry in the UK. There is a requirement within legislation for food companies to know that the product that they're being provided with from their suppliers meets those requirements. So traceability is one step backwards. You don't need to go further back than that because you expect your supplier, they're being supplied, to have the same level of traceability. So that's obviously something that's taken quite seriously too. But of course, when fraud happens, and it does happen in the food industry, and some of you remember some examples in recent years, hopefully most of them have been fairly limited, but some of them haven't. I'll give you an example. Sometimes fruit juice, particularly orange juice, is adulterated with cheaper juices, and that can be quite difficult to actually identify. You may have heard a few years ago in China that baby milk was being supplemented with melamine, which is pretty dangerous stuff, as you all know. And a few children in China did lose their lives, unfortunately, as a result of that. They were putting melamine into milk because it contains high levels of nitrogen, and that the test for protein content looks for nitrogen. So they were artificially high in terms of protein, and obviously that was used to sell more product. There have been other examples. Olive oil has occasionally been adulterated with cheaper vegetable oils, and sometimes people have added chlorophyll to give that kind of little green colour that makes it look like it's extra virgin olive oil. That has happened again, quite limited, but these things do happen. So it happens, and fraud does exist, and it is very difficult for food companies, unless they're routinely testing for these kinds of things, or know they're going to happen, or are happening, to actually spot them. Because they do rely a lot on this concept of auditing and supply chain management, which is, pretty important, taken very seriously, as I said already. That is, of course, supplemented by testing. But as has been pointed out previously, that's not at the level that maybe is going to be happening in the future. Certainly at the moment, quite a few of the food companies involved in this have publicly stated they're going to do an awful lot more testing in future. And I'm sure that's what they'll do for quite a long period of time. So I think it's important to point out that the food industry does take this stuff very seriously and is constantly trying to make sure these things don't happen. But of course, when you're dealing with criminals and criminal activity, this happens in all sorts of different sectors, not just food. It happens in pharmaceuticals and all sorts of different areas. And they do try very, very hard to get this right. But unfortunately, sometimes the industry gets caught out.
First of all, thank the panellists for keeping so well to time, as well as the insightful perspectives on the issue. I think there were some common themes that came out of that. Discussion quite a lot on the supply chains, the complexities of managing that. I'm back onto this again, am I?
discussions around the supply chain, the complexities of managing that, discussions really around the relative importance of managing supply chains to testing, the importance of making sure that we have an emergency response contingency, that we continue to do proper research. And I think a number of the panelists making the point that they were actually surprised by the scale of the current incident. So those were I think some common themes. I now want to hand it over to the floor. If when you ask a question, if you could say who you are first, and then fire the question, and I'll try and direct it to the appropriate panelists. There's a question at the back.
I'm Clive Thompson, Chief Scientist at Alcontrol Laboratories. Before I ask my main question, just a comment to Mark saying that you couldn't possibly pick this up by analysis. I agree you couldn't pick the chondrohydrin up, but if you'd done a quantitative assessment of the heparin, you'd immediately know there's a deficit and therefore something should have been done about it. So analysis of product for adulteration, you can analyse the main components relatively easily, and surely that should have been picked up.
Can I just answer that? I'm not trying to defend the situation except to say that the levels of contamination which could be harmful might only be in the single percentages, and therefore the product may well have met its specification.
If you've only added 1%, you're not going to make any economic advantage. It probably cost you more money than just using 100% heparin. Surely if you're going to adulterate something, you've got to add a significant amount to make the crime worthwhile.
I want to be careful here because I think we're probably getting off the main subject. When you're dealing with the quantities involved, a few percent can be an extremely financially beneficial position. And the point being made is this was deliberately criminal activity, and the standard tests as they were defined did not detect it. No, sorry, that's the point. Okay.
Just want to bring that one up. No. My main point is that I've been involved in water analysis for the last 40 years, and the water companies, and the amount spent on regulatory water analysis in this country is significantly more, and the amount of analysis carried out is significantly more than what's carried out for foods. Yet water has to be 99.8% water before it will pass as a regulatory approved water supply. It's audited by the Drinking Water Inspectorate, and they have big teeth. And the water industry has worked together. Now, with respect to emergencies, water contamination emergencies, there's obviously big national kind of programs looking at water terrorism. But if something really nasty were to happen, or as a major contamination, there's not enough capacity, certainly in my view and certainly in the water industry's view. And the water labs have all worked together since 1994. I helped set up at the UK Water Laboratories Mutual Aid Group, and we meet once a year. We've got 3 subgroups, one on organic analysis, one on radioactivity analysis, and one where we set up an emergency proficiency scheme, which is unlike any normal scheme. You don't know what's coming, you don't know when it's going to come, and you're not told what to analyse for. You've got to find it and report it back at PDQ. And we've set up mutual aid statements of our analysis capabilities. These are renewed twice a year, so with 24-hour contact numbers. We've kept the lawyers out. Everything's done on a reasonable endeavours basis. So if one water company has a problem, they've got about 18 other labs they can ring to get help. You're not obliged to, but it has worked. It's all been done off our own backs. And I think this doesn't happen because of the more intense competition in the food industry, food private labs, but I think this is what is needed. If they could work together on screening methods, new techniques for picking up, not how to improve routine methods, but how to pick up contaminants and work together, share intelligence, and these annual meetings really work well, and we're all in internet contact, and I think if we do this for water, we need to do this for food. And if we have 1% of the Afghanistan war budget, we will solve the problem. Sorry.
Be better coordination?
Yes, I think the food labs should be working together like the water industry labs. Although we still compete on a commercial basis, with respect to emergencies, we don't think there's a competition, and it will it protects the country.
Liz, would you like to comment on
Okay, thank you for that question. I mean, it's very useful to have people here from the water regulatory side of things and from the pharmaceutical side of things as a comparison. The testing system for food for enforcement is split into several bodies. As far as food microbiological safety or food hygiene is concerned, in England, the Health Protection Agency have a network of laboratories who do work together and are centrally funded, who test food hygiene samples for microbiological pathogens. As far as everything else is concerned, and by everything else, I mean food standards, chemical contaminants, composition, authenticity, labelling, the Public Analyst Laboratory Network is responsible, but I use network in the loosest form of the word because, as I mentioned previously, the laboratories are not part of a central body. They've all sprung up independently over the history of time. They're not necessarily located as an even geographical spread across the country. And they did work together very well probably until about the 1980s when compulsory competitive tendering came in local authorities. And it used to be that a local authority would use their own local lab. But a lot of labs have closed, so they might use the next nearest one. But the reality is that local authorities put their analysis work out to tender now. So it may be that a laboratory in Wolverhampton is providing analytical services to a local authority in Scotland. We do still have a professional association for public analysts, and we do work together to share information. And I think certainly it's been very interesting to note that during this current issue, labs have been sharing information and intelligence very well. But the fact does remain that we are in stiff competition with each other. And unfortunately, we're competing over a diminishing amount of work. So if a laboratory loses work, it's in danger of potentially being closed down. Now, I realise that that's the reality of commercial life these days. But it certainly doesn't in any way help the UK to have a robust system where new methodology is being developed, methods, intelligence are being shared between laboratories and public analysts. And it may be providing a cheap system to local authorities, but ultimately, if allowed to continue the way it's going at the moment, it may well be that there is insufficient capacity, or it all ends up with one provider who can then charge what they like.
Thanks for that response. Is there anybody else in the panel want to comment, or are there any more questions from the floor? There's one question there.
Sorry.
One back there. Yeah.
My name is Jim Mackenzie. I spent 40 years in the chemical industry supplying the food industry, amongst others. I was taking the point that was first made about monitoring and control. I agree with the first speaker that monitoring is not the same as control, although monitoring is obviously essential. As regards water, I've spent a lot of time supplying chemicals to treat water after it's been delivered by companies such as Yorkshire Water. And it's one product, and it's mostly generated in this country. The problem with the food industry, as I see, is that the food comes from all over the world. So there's a lot more difficulty in setting up a system that's particularly now a part of a single market in Europe. Presumably a lot of this is done in Europe now, or should be done in Europe maybe, I don't know. But simply following what's done in the water industry may not be appropriate for the food industry. Just a comment, anyway.
Okay. Well, thank you for that input. I guess I've received a few things through Twitter now, and one of them, I think, relates to the point that you've just made. So a question from Philip Hunt from Brussels. It says, best food is locally sourced. How can test facilities cover all local areas across the country for safe food? Chris, do you want to start with that one? Okay.
Right, where do you start with that one? That's a really great question. I mean, obviously the food industry is trying to minimise what is called, and I'm sure you've heard the phrase, food miles. But it's not necessarily easy. If you want to eat strawberries in the middle of December, they're not going to be grown in the UK. So there are some issues around people's expectations and consumer expectations on food and when it's available, particularly seasonable items. Having said that, I think a lot of the food retailers are starting to source some of their products, particularly vegetables, locally. You can see some of that provenance on pack in many supermarkets these days. So there is a move to doing some of that, and that's a response to things like farmers' markets, which are doing very, very well. And you can buy some fantastic products at farmers' markets and those kinds of markets throughout the country. So people are starting to source their things more locally, and that's obviously a very good idea for lots of reasons. But of course, the retailers respond to consumer demands, and if the consumer wants oranges all the way through the year, then obviously those oranges need to be sourced from somewhere, and they're not going to come from the UK, clearly. And what was the second part of the question? Sorry.
It was about the testing facilities and how they can cope with in terms of locally generated foods.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure that's a question for me, to be honest. But I think it depends on what you're testing for. If you're looking at food safety or food quality or authenticity, then there are different laboratories that can do some or all of those things. Local laboratories may or may not be able to cope with some of those things. It does depend to some extent, and there are a number of independent laboratories around the UK, including Leatherhead, of course, that does a lot of this kind of work. We get most of our work from, we're a membership-based organisation, we get most of our work from our members, but we do get samples from small companies that are not members of Leatherhead pretty routinely as well. So that work does get done. I'm not entirely sure that answers the question, but hopefully it contributes a little bit.
Another question that came on Twitter may provide an answer to that, and maybe it's something I can pass over to you, Mark. Would cheaper, faster tests spot unknown meat materials, and if so, are they being developed?
Well, I think you always want to find the fastest and most universal test for the subject you're trying to look at. The problem with food is that it's really quite there's a mass of regulations which cover the labeling and description of foods, and each one of those requires individual methods to look at it. So it's all very well having one product like water to look at. I know it's not as simple, as straightforward. There's lots of things can go in water, but when you look at food, the issues that you've got to cover are quite immense, really. I know that from experience trying to run a research program. So I think it is it's very nice to have fast methods, but what I found is you can only have a method, you can only find the suitable technology to do what you want to do. So if you can do it with a dipstick type test, that's fine. If you want to look at sugars, branded white spirits, you can have a very quick test to look at a sugar profile, which brand owners put in their white spirits to check that they are the brand that they are. But if you want to look at where something comes from, then you've got to do a quite complicated test to look at the geological isotopes, the biological isotopes, the trace elements, which link that food to where it was grown or where it was to where it came from. And there you can't simply use some sort of simple test. It's quite difficult. So all I would say is that yes, if you can have a fast test, fine. Methanol in spirits or something like that, that's great. But most of the time, unfortunately, the technology doesn't allow you to transfer it to a rapid test.
I think the answer to that was probably no, not at the moment. Yeah. A question
Yeah, I think something that hasn't quite been touched on by the panellists, but it's so implicit in this question that I think we should talk about it a little bit. It sort of came out, I was listening to a discussion that Nicky Campbell was running on Sunday morning on his discussion program, and they were discussing this whole question. In discussing this whole problem of food fraud in relation to the horse meat contamination, one lady made a very interesting comment which almost sounded ridiculous, but she said, well, the problem is with the sheer complexity of the food, processed food that we eat. It's because it's really complex mixtures and all sorts of opportunities arise in order to then hide ingredients. And so her comment was, if you have to put a list of ingredients on it, don't buy it. Because the opportunities there is to hide things. And I don't know about you, as I get older, I can't even read the ingredients anymore because the writing's getting so small. So the question I have, which is a serious one, and I think it's as we're always asking the question, is what we're buying really what we want is just how acceptable is it to constantly hide cheaper ingredients in our processed food? I think it's because it's what processed food is really all about, isn't it? When we make food at home, we mix things together to enhance the recipes and flavors. But the food industry, I sort of get the feeling that one of the motivations is to keep the price down, sure, but also to maximize the profit margin. So, discuss.
I'm afraid this may be coming back to you again, Chris.
It feels like quite a deep problem, a deep question, but maybe I'm deluded.
I mean, I think your question was, is it appropriate to hide ingredients? Clearly it isn't. It's illegal. It's not possible within the UK food law and European food law to have horse meat in a ready meal, for example, without it being on the label. It's perfectly possible to have horse in a food product in the UK, but it has to be labelled as such. So yes, the simple answer to your question is that no, it's not appropriate, and the food industry tries very, very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. But I think behind your question is possibly another question, which is around people increasingly buying convenience foods. Many, many years ago, before we were all born probably, everybody sourced everything locally. When it was seasonal, and nobody bought lasagnas from the supermarket. Probably made lasagnas at all, but you take my point. So things have changed enormously, and we as consumers have asked for that to happen. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with people buying ready meals and more complex food products because we're all, pretty time stretched these days in the modern economy. And people ask for that and want it. So there's nothing wrong with that, but, obviously it needs to be done legally and appropriately.
Absolutely. If I could just respond to that. And I hear what you're saying, but what I suspect is that the general public are not aware of the legislation. The legislation is complex. And I suspect they are often buying things that they don't realize. They probably don't know what an emulsifier is very often. They don't understand why certain ingredients are being added, and some of the ingredients are clearly being added to stretch food, to bulk them. And there's a number of examples, and it sort of then relates to the public not being aware of just what the legislation is, and therefore they're not aware what they're buying. And okay, it's not a food, but I understand the legislation behind blended Scotch, for instance, as an example, does not mean a blend of Scotches. You probably know what the legislation is on that, but it's an example of how the public are completely surprised when you talk to the general public about what some of the legislation is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the answer to that really is that the food legislation exists to protect the consumer. So you're not allowed to put any emulsifier into a food product that's been labelled, and without that product being considered safe to consume. And there's a lot of very careful work that gets done to make sure that all food ingredients are okay to be consumed by the general public. So I'm not sure I accept that entirely as an issue, if I'm being honest with you. I do take your point, but I think there's increasing demand, as we know recently, in recent years, to reduce things like salt in food, particularly in processed foods. And that's fine, and we all understand the reasons why that's required. But that has huge knock-on effects in terms of things like food safety and also shelf life. People expect to be able to buy food products these days that last several days in the fridge or in the cupboard or wherever. And if you reduce some of these emulsifiers, reduce salt, reduce sugar, take some of these other preservatives out, then you are significantly affecting the shelf life and potentially the food safety of some of these products. So a lot of those ingredients are there for very, very good reasons that, again, consumers expect. I think, your point about sometimes these things are added to reduce cost, again, sometimes that's true. But then again, when we go to a supermarket, you see a product for £1 and a product for £1.50, a lot of people want to go for the one for £1, naturally. And that might be only achievable at £1 by making some of these ingredients possible and put into what is potentially quite a complex mixture of food.
Do you have a point related to it,
Peter Morris. I've got a question. It's really a question to the panel, which to my mind has never been addressed in public since this scandal began, and that is, do you have any idea how long this horse meat adulteration has been going on? And added to that, I have a second question, and that is there any kind of archive or reserve collection of food samples that enable you that if something is found wrong with food today, you can go back and test samples from 1 year ago, 2 years ago, to see if a problem is done? I mean, maybe something quite different from horse meat. It might be contamination with drugs or something like that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for your question. I think Mark's putting his hand up there. He's keen to respond.
I'll answer the second part first, actually. Yes, the Food Standards Agency have set up a food fraud database. So all the activities of the local authorities in collecting and analysing samples are put on this database. It's a database which is like the police database, and it can often make connections between disparate bits of information to show that where perhaps food fraud it's got a pattern across the country. And obviously that can be interrogated, and you can find when things have been analysed and what the results were. I think one of the things I would like to see, actually, perhaps, which answers the first part, and is how long has this problem been going on? I think the question is we don't know because it wasn't investigated. But my own feeling is it's been going on in Europe for quite some time, actually. And I'm not sure for how long it's been going on in the UK, but certainly in Europe it's been going on for quite a long time. And what it would be very nice to see is better coordination between the UK authorities and the authorities in all the other member states, and perhaps having some sort of European food fraud database that can be interrogated and would alert member states that something's been found in one member state. Okay, someone might have done a horse meat sample somewhere in Germany or Italy, and that could be alerting other member states. So I think that something that really needs to be addressed is either some form of better coordination between European member states, and perhaps it's something the Commission should be responsible. They have a very good system for rapid alerts for often mainly safety issues, but it's not doesn't seem quite so effective for just authenticity and fraud issues, actually.
Thank you, Mark. I hope that answers your question. Gentleman in front.
Thank you. I'm Robin Bell. I used to work for DEFRA some 10 years ago, dealing with the import and export side. I would like to ask a question. Well, first of all, we've heard on the media that some tests have detected horse meat at 1% or less than 1% horse DNA. What is the sensitivity and the specificity of the testing that you're doing? And the one thing I was always taught when I was about to consider testing, make damn sure you know what you're going to do with the result you get. Because if you don't, you're in trouble. And if you, I have some concern to hear about the pressure that's on the laboratories, working 24 hours, lots of samples coming through. You need to have very good techniques, very good systems, no contamination, especially if you're talking about PCR. And what cover have you got for a claim against you by a major supermarket where you get the result wrong and their reputation is destroyed?
Liz, would you like to pick up on that one?
Okay, that's a very good question, and I was hoping somebody would ask, because I think there's been a lot of confusion about what is and isn't achievable with the testing. I might have been exaggerating slightly that maybe laboratories aren't quite working around the clock, but they certainly are working very, very long hours. All official control laboratories are accredited and have to be accredited to ISO 17025 calibration and testing standard, and all are. The majority of the laboratories doing the DNA testing are specifically accredited for DNA testing, and all laboratories performing the analysis will be using fully validated methods where the limit of detection of the method has been established in advance, and positive and negative controls are used to ensure that false positives or negatives are reported. As far as the current survey of testing has been done, the last thing anyone wants to do is declare a product that contains horse when it doesn't. And any positive results are being confirmed. They're either being confirmed by real-time PCR if they've been done using a lab-on-a-chip technique in the first place. And DNA sequencing is also being used to confirm positive results obtained by real-time PCR. I don't think any public analyst laboratory in the land would report a positive result for horse based on a single test. There would always be a degree of checking, and of course, as you said, cross-contamination is a very serious concern, and laboratories will have to have taken steps to validate and check the sample preparation and extraction procedures to ensure that cross-contamination isn't occurring. As far as the limit of detection of the method is concerned, there are different limits depending on the technique used. The ELISA technique, which is looking for horse proteins, generally is considered to have a limit of detection of around 1%, and that's 1% protein as a proportion of the meat protein in the sample. Though it's generally accepted that the limit of detection is probably lower than that, but that's an effective reporting limit. For DNA analysis and for real-time PCR, the effective limit of detection is much lower than that. And certainly the methods can get down to 2 or 3 copy numbers of DNA. So we're looking at less than 0.01% for that particular technique. Now, this obviously opens up a whole other debate about what is acceptable to the public. The public may well say that a zero tolerance should be applied, but anyone who's involved with testing or the food industry would know that that's pretty much technically impossible. But of course, horse, people may not be so upset about that, but there is the issue, of course, of particular foods such as halal or kosher foods, which are sold on the understanding that they are free of pork. And in that case, it may be that a lower tolerance would apply, because it may be acceptable to have 0.5% of horse DNA in a product, whereas it would not be acceptable to have 0.5% of pork. And I would just like to point out as well that I mentioned the ELISA test, which looks for horse proteins. So if you get a positive, then you know that there are horse proteins present in that product. With DNA, we're looking for the actual DNA, which could come from any part of the animal. So it has been reported in the media that these products contain horse meat. Now that has been established in some cases by traceability, where horse meat has been found to actually be present on premises. But just to make it very clear, the testing is looking for horse DNA, not horse meat.
Thank you. A very comprehensive response. There's a very good question. We've got a couple of burning questions at the back to start with, and gentlemen here, we'll try and get through these answers quickly if we can.
Helen Deschamps, just a member of the public. About labeling, I'm always shocked when I see as a label product of more than one country, or even from EU. Apart from that, about processed food and unprocessed, I don't eat processed food, I eat fresh vegetable, but they are processed. I know for a fact that there are chemicals which are not allowed in France. Farmers are not allowed to use some chemicals, but they are allowed in Spain. And I know that some French farmers nip out to Spain to get them back to France. And so I just don't know the extent of it. But I wonder if we couldn't test those chemicals when fresh vegetables come in whatever country, or stop those processed vegetable at the border.
Yeah, it would be
I would like to know if it's possible to test chemicals used growing vegetable, like fertilizers and the other one.
Okay. Did you catch that? So the question is...
And pesticide.
Testing of chemicals in vegetables. I guess anyone in the panel can pick that up, yes. Yeah.
Okay, yes, I've said that. The pesticide, use of pesticides on agricultural produce is, the legislation is harmonised across the European Union. There have been some national derogations in previous years, but that's all being removed, and it should all be harmonised now. Pesticide residue testing is carried out in a way that produce is actually screened for generally around 400 different compounds. So it's not a case of just looking for pesticides that are known to be used on that particular type of product. The pesticides that comprise the screen are pesticides that are currently permitted, but also include pesticides that are not permitted as well. And certainly where there's any intelligence that a particular pesticide is being used illegally, that information would generally be shared around the European Union. So any produce should be being tested for anything that's likely to be present, either legally or illegally. Obviously, there are thousands of different pesticides, and it's impossible to test for all of them. But I think that I can reassure you that the majority of those likely to be present are being tested for. And if you look at the results of testing on fruit and vegetables, the majority of them are actually clear of any pesticide residues.
Okay, thank you, Liz. One more question at the back.
Hello, John Robinson, public analyst, Minton Tryon Davis. Following up on the comments which the panel made earlier about testing for everything and what can be done, we hear anecdotally that organised crime is getting more involved with food fraud because there are better margins than in other areas. Should we be looking not for just the known things, but a certain amount of research and a certain amount of routine testing in public analyst labs, say, is actually looking for the unknowns rather than targeting out always on a very small range of things we're looking for? And the second bit is that we seem to, every few years, have a number of these food incidents. There is a drive to make the labs more efficient, more cost-effective, pare everything back. Should there be amount of resilience left in the labs for these incidents so that we have capacity, maybe this is paid for centrally, or some way that we can make sure that when these occur, which they will do, there is a capability there to address them without a mad rush and really everybody's sort of, they're doing their best, but there is nothing left in the system to cope with this. For the whole panelist, please.
Okay. Who wants to pick that up? Do you want to start, Mark?
Okay. I wanted to go back one step, actually, that and perhaps reiterate what someone said about end product testing isn't always the best way of finding where the fraud is. And certainly when I was running the program at the Food Standards Agency, most of the subjects we chose to do surveys came from intelligence, and that intelligence was provided largely by the industry themselves, because there was unfair competition going on within the industry, and they wanted to obviously make sure that the whole market wasn't affected, and also from local authorities who picked up things from the local industry or in their testing. So I think you can do an awful lot through intelligence rather than through testing. But having said that, obviously once you find the intelligence, then you have to act on it and do the testing, and that's when you need A, the method, and B, the capability of doing it, and that's often the difficult part of it. But anyway, there we go. Do you want to?
If I could just add to what Mark has said, I would reiterate what I said in my introductory remarks. That the DEFRA have had an authenticity programme which has been dormant recently, but I think will now be resurrected. And certainly this research and development does need to be taking place. It needs to be administered centrally. But of course, there has to be the laboratory network there to actually be able to roll out these methods and use them for enforcement purposes when they're actually developed.
If I could make a comment, as I was the person, I think, who was suggesting that testing isn't the answer to everything that we're discussing. I think, obviously, testing is a great value when you're seeking to confirm a position. But if you imagine that we could ever test sufficiently to rule out any risk, I think we're fooling ourselves. Even if we had the battery of tests that were necessary, what sort of sample do you imagine you would have to take in order for it to be in any way significant? It has to go back to requiring the suppliers of food, as far as I can see, to be responsible for their supply chains and to seek to verify that. And as I say, I'd be very reluctant to make any suggestions to the Food Standards Agency, because I'm sure they're better capable of working this out than I am. But a lot of their attention should be determining that suppliers are actually doing that, rather than simply trying to police the whole world, which is, I think, a fruitless task, frankly. You have to have a process in place that verifies the supply chain, and then, as we've said, a capability to test on the basis of intelligence and information that's available. Targeted testing rather than blanket testing.
Thank you, Gerald. As I say, the parallel with pharmaceuticals is actually a very powerful one. Chris?
Just to build on that, just slightly, I'd almost like to throw the question back to the questioner. I completely agree with the rest of the panel that these things have to be done in a very targeted way with intelligence. You could potentially test for every single meat species, if you like, every animal on the planet. I mean, we're not looking for giraffe at the moment. We're not looking for hedgehog or badger. You know, I hope to God none of that's in our food. I'm sure it isn't. But in theory, you'd have to test for everything. It would cost more money to do that than the entire sales value of ready meals in Europe. It just can't be done.
Can I just come back on that? Yes, I accept there should be targeted testing. What I was saying is maybe there should be part of the budget kept aside to do some looking at where we've had problems in the past, maybe looking much wider. Maybe you're not aware, in the last maybe 5 years, the testing, we used to do maybe 10 different tests on a product. A lot of times now we just do a single test because it's cheap. It's what's been said is most likely to be there. We think there might be other things there. From our previous experience, it's worth checking out. And we've been advised, well, don't do that because it costs too much. We want to do, just do a little bit of this. It's probably going to be the biggest hit. But there are other things which, old frauds which come round periodically and when they're not being looked at. So I'm saying it's not shot in the dark and should sort of, I think sometimes they're looking too narrowly. They're very much focused on particular targets they're getting from the intel and they're not listening to people on the ground saying, well, there could be other things there. Look a little bit wider. Look at what's happened in the past. Horse meat, this is the third time it's come round in probably in the last 30 years. So I'm just saying, should we be balancing the two? And we've gone very much from trying to test everything, which you can't do, to very much focusing on target. And there should be a bit of middle ground, and maybe there should be a bit of that. Yes, we need the research which has been done to look for future frauds or identifying what's already out there. We need to be checking the methods we're using aren't being, the fraudsters have found a way around them, but we should be looking at that. And as to the second issue I was saying was also, we still need to have spare capacity there, which isn't there anymore.
Okay. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
We've had a reasonable debate on that. I'm quite a quick word.
Just one final question back, really. What sample would you use to make such testing effective?
What do you mean by what sample?
Well, I mean, you've clearly got to decide that you're going to sample so many types of food from so many outlets. You can never do 100% testing, and food is such a diverse commodity. It's difficult to imagine that you would ever have the assurance that would be necessary based on a sufficient sample size and a representative enough sample.
I wasn't saying total sampling, sorry.
I think I bring this part of the debate because I think it's a very, very interesting issue, and I think we could end up debating this for a lot of the night. There are other questions to be asked. Can I pass the microphone to the lady?
Thank you. My name's Mary Rabowance. Firstly, a facetious remark about giraffes. You said you wouldn't be testing for giraffes, but since Tesco has just bought the giraffe chain, then perhaps you ought to think about it. But more seriously, is part of the problem with government that when these issues arise, then they do things. We had BSE, they set up the FSA, but after a few years, they become complacent and they break things up, or they split laboratories. They think there isn't a problem. And then, it goes in cycles. The next emergency comes and they do something. But there isn't this continuous level of a proper control and testing, or whatever you need, intelligence. And shouldn't we be doing more on a European-wide basis now, as is done in the field of medicines? Yeah. Not on testing, but on the intelligence gathering.
Who would like to feedback on that before I pick on you, Mark? Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, I'm not sure I 100% agree with what you just said. I think there is a lot of testing done. The FSA do a lot of surveillance work around food safety. I think that's pretty good. Obviously people could do more. They could do more with more funding, I'm sure. The FSA's funding, I'm sure Mark knows an awful lot more about this than I do. It's been cut dramatically, I think, over the last few years. So they're not doing as much work in this area as they were before. They're certainly not doing any authenticity work that I'm aware of. That's moved out of their domain. So it depends a little bit on what you're talking about. About food safety, I think that does happen, and it's pretty good. In terms of authenticity, I'm not sure that it is as good as it could be.
Okay, does that answer your question? We have a couple more before we proceed.
Malcolm Barnett, retired public analyst and former president of the APA. we've skirted around a lot of parts of this particular subject. What we don't know at the moment, and perhaps the information is there, is how this particular fraud happened to be perpetrated and how it was found out. Was it by intelligence or what? Most of the frauds recently, for example, the melamine in the milk was found because of the deaths of a number of children, and the adulteration of the heparin by a number of deaths as well. It seems to be most of these things are found out fortuitously. I was talking by chance to a public analyst today working in the pesticide field, who is normally sent dried legumes for testing of one particular type for dichlorvos, one of the pesticides. And by chance, the sampling officer sent the wrong type of a sample. So when it got to the lab, they were wondering, well, this isn't part of our testing program. Should we test for it? So they tested for it anyway because it was there and found vast amounts of dichlorvos in another product which wouldn't have been within their normal sampling program. So all this is found out fortuitously. All the things like the horse is, to use a phrase which I don't like, below horizon. You don't know it's going to happen. Testing, you can't do testing on everything. I've been in labs sufficient number of years to know that. And I've also done many factory inspections in the last 10 years and used a lot of traceability. In traceability, you can see things in the factory if you ask the right questions, look at the right documents, and look at every barrel and every package that's around there. You can see things which shouldn't be there. On the question of horse meat, it would appear that there were forged documents to say that this was beef. I may be wrong, but I cannot see anything else how this could have happened. The answer surely then is, firstly, I do agree with shortening the food chain, but that's going to use or require the use of many homegrown products, which would be a good thing. Whether it's anti-competitive, I don't know. We would find out in due course. But the question of fraud and the documentation must be the one that has to be addressed. Whether you call it intelligence on the floor or whatever you call it, the stuff has to be accepted somewhere. And the fraudulent material must be looked at. If you have a chain of five different suppliers for meat, the original one has to go to the next one and the next one. How you actually monitor all these things and who it's down to, that really is a discussion that should be taking place. Loads of analysis will not find it. These things are all below the horizon. They will not be found. What you need is that the proper controls are at every part of the supply chain.
Thank you very much. I think sort of agreeing with the point that Gerald's making about the control of supply chains. Unless anyone else in the panel has got anything to add to that, can I bring a question to the front here?
Can I? Hang on. Sorry, can I get
Oh, sorry. I don't know whether the question was already asked in a way by this previous speaker, but how serious are the government cuts, and should we be worried about it? How does it work? I mean, how many labs are being closed? How serious is it? Because we keep hearing about cuts.
Liz, do you want to?
When you say government cuts, obviously all government departments have had to bear their share of cuts. And when I've been talking about the laboratory facilities, that doesn't sort of come under the scope of central government cuts. It's generally tends to be local government cuts. So in that respect, it's not really happening in a controlled way. Obviously, the Food Standards Agency and DEFRA will have had budget cuts, and one hopes that they have been able to still provide a level of service that they feel they need to by making efficiency savings. But things will obviously have had to give. The issue with the laboratories is that it's not happening in a controlled way. It's down to, for instance, the Somerset County Council laboratory is closing at the end of this month. That's a local decision by Somerset County councillors who are not really concerned with the provision of testing for the UK. They're concerned with the services they provide to Somerset County Council taxpayers. So in that respect, it's not happening in a controlled way. Every local authority is required to appoint a public analyst, which can consist of writing a letter to a public analyst, the person, and saying, we hereby appoint you as our public analyst. There's no requirement for a local authority to run a laboratory, and there's no requirement for a local authority to take any samples and submit them to a public analyst. Every local authority has to assess the food businesses in their area and produce a risk-based sampling and enforcement plan every year. But judging by the sampling returns that some local authorities, all local authorities have to make returns to the Food Standards Agency on how many inspections they've done and how many samples they've taken. And it certainly is the case that the number of samples taken has dropped considerably in the last 3 years, and some local authorities have made nil returns. So that either means that the food safety in that area is 100% compliant, or they have taken the decision to put the resources that they've used previously for testing elsewhere.
I'm very conscious of time, but Duncan, you've had a burning question now for a while, so we'll probably make this up.
Thank you, Derek. Duncan Campbell, public analyst based in West Yorkshire, former president of the Association of Public Analysts, so you're lucky to have 3 either past the current APA presidents in the room. We're very rare creatures, you know. The question I've been going to ask has changed as the debate has gone on, because as we've gone on, new things have come up. And of course, I've been fortunate in being able to contribute to the sort of debate around this in the media and try and keep it well informed. But there are a number of, things that seem that they're quite, juxtapositions of things that don't really fit together. We know local authorities have to have a risk-based sampling program, and as Liz said, some don't take any samples at all. There are 7 million people in England live in local authorities that take no food standards samples, for instance. There are 4 London boroughs that take no food safety samples. Liz and I had lunch together today in Camden. I was speaking to the people who run the cafe before we left, and he was talking about their inspections. I said, do they take any samples? No, they don't. So my question to the panel is, we realise more than ever because of the horse meat scandal about the very complicated and long food supply chains we have. KPMG, I think, have done a survey that a supermarket lasagna, there will be 400 and something transactions for the ingredients for that. If I was making lasagna at home, it would be 20 ingredients. We've got a global food network. We've got local authorities making decisions. Do we take any samples? Do we provide a laboratory? But those choices, those decisions, don't just affect the locality of that laboratory, that local authority. They affect the whole country. So what is the solution to ensure that we have an adequate testing regime to protect the public, not just in terms of food safety, but in the words of the Food Standards Act 1999, otherwise protect the public's interest in relation to food, which is one of the duties that the agency still has, because it's in the statute, which is one thing that the current coalition administration weren't able to change in the machinery of government changes that hived off functions to the Department of Health and to DEFRA.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Who in the panel wants to respond to that?
I think Duncan does make a very good point that decisions should be made at local level concerning things like farmers' markets, local producers. There are lots of very small artisan food producers springing up in the last few years, and in my opinion, it's only right that they should be looked at locally. But the fact that 80% of the food we buy comes from the main 5 supermarket chains, it seems ridiculous to me that local authorities all over the country are walking into Tesco and taking a sample of Tesco baked beans and sending it to a lab in some part of the country to be tested. And it certainly in the rest of Europe, the regime for enforcing food safety is centralised, and it's much more efficient. There are much greater economies of scale, and the resources available to enforce food safety can be much better targeted. So there may be a case for some sort of a two-tier system in the UK where some things can be done locally and others nationally. But of course, it's not just a case of looking at the science or looking at what would work most efficiently. This is obviously a political issue as well, one of whether things should be decided locally or nationally.
I'm very conscious of time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to bring questions after we end this program. And to the panelists, we have a minute left, so it will be really 10-second question. Yeah?
We have a lot of experience sitting on the panel there who've probably seen all sorts of different flavors, dare I say, of food fraud. Okay? So where will the next major food fraud scandal come from? Right. I think you might have seen the question already.
Each person can answer it, but...
Yeah, where would it be? Will it be a pesticide scandal? Will it be some major adulteration? What part of the food chain might it... What part of the industry might it be in? Just gut feeling.
Don't know. Sorry, that was a bit flippant. At Leatherhead, we work with a lot of food companies on a kind of a new service that we've devised, which is called temptation analysis. And what we do with that is look at their supply chains, their whole processes, everything, and to see where the possibilities are in terms of fraud. And we've done that with a few companies over the years, and it's proved quite interesting. Some of the things where they're particularly, maybe sensitive to some introduction from fraud, is very, very case specific, and we just don't know what the next thing is going to be. But hopefully, it's not going to be for a very long time.
Thanks, Chris. A word.
Well, again, I don't know the answer to that question. There are a lot of other food frauds out there, and there always have been. Some are very sophisticated, and it's difficult to keep up with what's going on. But some are, like the horse meat issue, have come around again. There was a horse meat scandal after the Second World War, and there have been several since then. So it's not a case of what's it going to be, it's just which one of them will come to light first. And that's not to be alarmist and say that everything is unsafe to eat.
I wouldn't presume to say where the next food fraud will come from, but one of the concepts that we developed, I think, for medicines, which is relevant, is the concept of supply chain risk assessment. And that's not just a matter for governments or even for public analysts. That's a matter for suppliers. An expectation that they've looked at the totality of their supply chain and they have assessed the risks. And I think the government's role is to actually expect to see that assessment during inspections.
Finally, Mark.
Okay, finally. Well, if I knew what the next food fraud was, I'd be a rich man, I think, eventually. All I would say is that someone asked the question, why was it just by luck that they looked at horse meat? And the answer is probably no, because, in fact, I know that suddenly there's a load of horses going to slaughter because of the economic situation in Ireland, for example, and there was also race horses as well. So you've got to look to where if something comes on the market that's very cheap and can be used to substitute, then that's where you're going to get the next fraud.
Thank you. I really must bring the debate to a close now. We're over time. There's an opportunity for us to ask more questions of the panelists if they're hanging around after the event. But I'd just like to thank all four of the panelists for really responding so well to the questions that were put in front of them, and to thank you, the audience, for really a very stimulating debate. So we can thank the panelists in the normal way. Right, I think the drinks are ready and waiting. That's okay.
Bearing with that difficulty. Sorry.
No.
Something. you very much. It's on to an extent. As they should. Yeah. Really, really good. Yeah. Excellent.